Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Tech and Society, the Corporate Response to Communities in Crisis panel. My name is Sophia Mirabella, and I'm a first-year full-time MBA student at UCLA Anderson that has had the pleasure of putting together today's discussion. The panel will include a 40 to 45-minute moderated discussion, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please use the platform to submit your questions for the panelists and upvote any questions that you would like to be asked. I'd now like to introduce Zubin Devar, who will be moderating today's discussion. Zubin is a UCLA Anderson alumni and double Bruin, whose background includes a combination of building businesses from scratch, scaling technology organizations, and stints in government. Zubin currently leads global business development and strategy at Google, supporting their emerging marketplace businesses, where he builds products and services to help millions of small and medium-sized businesses recover post-pandemic. Outside of Google, he serves on the advisory council for the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, as a board trustee for the California Science Center, and on the executive committee for UCLA Anderson's Alumni Board of Directors. We're honored to have him here with us today. Zubin, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the panelists.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you, Sophia, and to your team for all the efforts you've put in to get us all together here today. I am really excited to be moderating this panel of esteemed leaders that we are all going to have the opportunity to hear from. Today's discussion will be centered around how, amidst the global pandemic and social unrest, how these major technology companies are expanding their role in our society by providing vital services to not only businesses, but also schools, families, and many more. And so before we get into that conversation, I'd love for each panelist to introduce themselves and then maybe share a little bit more about your career progression and how you currently got into the current role that you occupy. So with that in mind, why don't we just get kicked off here and start with folks going left to right in the slide. We'll start with Cami and then go to Joan right after.
Thanks, Zubin, and thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here today. My name's Cami Erickson, and I am a director of social impact at LinkedIn. And in my current role, I oversee our partnership strategy, our philanthropy in North America, and also our global employee engagement programs. And prior to that, I've spent my whole career in the social impact space, starting at Ashoka in DC, where I supported social entrepreneurs around the world, and then at BSR, where I did sustainability consulting and partnership development.
Hey everyone, my name is Joan Hanaui, and I'm equally so happy to be here. I am a proud Bruin, so it's always fun to be back in the UCLA community. I currently lead social impact initiatives at Lyft, and my journey to Lyft actually started back at UCLA. When I was still a student, I had met a woman named Grace Kim who led a social impact consulting firm and worked with her and a ton of Fortune 500 companies advising on social impact strategies. One of my last clients was Lyft. And after I helped build out the roadmap for the strategy, decided to join the team full time to actually do the work we planned. And so I've been here for the past 3 years helping build transportation access and equity programs.
Let's go to Erica next.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Erica Hawkes, and I am the Executive Director of Government and External Affairs at Verizon. I have about 20 years of experience working for elected officials at the state, local, and most recently as an Obama appointee at the White House. I've always been committed to the issue of social justice and inclusion, and that is why I was lucky to accept a position with Verizon, whose credo is basically aligned with my beliefs. So I'm happy to work for an organization that's committed to the community as we find technology solutions so we can move the society forward together. Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Naomi Morenzoni. I'm the Senior Vice President of Philanthropy Strategy at Salesforce, and my team manages our community response. So most recently, our COVID-19 philanthropic response, and then more recently, our Racial Equality and Justice Task Force to support our communities. I actually have some great overlaps with my panelists here. I started part of my career at Google, worked there, and then was also at Business for Social Responsibility before coming to Salesforce, and I've been here for the past 8 years.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to everyone again, to all our panelists for joining us. We're honored to have some of your time. I'd love to dig right in. Why don't we start with a common topic, pervasive topic at the moment with regards to our response to COVID, particularly your company's response to COVID. So while COVID has affected all of us, some, however, like small businesses, students from low-income families and underserved communities were hit much harder than others. And so what was one of the ways that your company's approach to supporting these uneven effects of the pandemic play out, and how was that initiative decided upon? Start with Erica.
Great, thank you. As we can all agree, COVID hit LA particularly very hard and disproportionately impacted communities of color who were exposed at a greater level because either one, they were essential workers, they also suffered a higher incidence of high propensity of job loss, they were exposed or contracted COVID and also hospitalized for the illness. So the pandemic impacted everyone. And one thing that I learned working for Verizon, I saw firsthand, is that we literally run to the fire to find a solution. And so Verizon was very upfront as trying to find solutions to address the issues as best as we could. And so one of the things that we did is we also felt the need and the importance of having access to affordable broadband and making sure folks had the equipment to utilize it. However, due to the pandemic, we saw many of our students falling further behind because they lacked internet connectivity. So in March of 2020, Verizon announced a partnership with LAUSD to provide internet access at no cost to over 125,000 students, to families who normally couldn't afford it. It was such a great program that the governor and the first partner adopted it, and in May 2020, it became an issue statewide with the California Department of Education. We also partnered with the Southeast Community Development Corporation in Huntington Park to provide hotspots and devices to our communities throughout LA County. We provided much equipment, also partnered with Ultimate Health Services, the largest FQHC, so that they could set up their pop-up COVID testing sites on the spots. And also we provided much needed equipment so they could see their senior patients who normally now couldn't come out due to the pandemic. We also partnered with Telecu, East LA Community College, DIY Girls, Asian American Advancing Justice, LA Pride, just to name a few, just to make sure that all of our communities stayed online. On a national level, we worked on several projects, including partnering with LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, investing $7.5 million to launch the Verizon Small Business Recovery Fund. We also committed $10 million to several organizations to support racial justice during the issue, $5 million to No Kids Hungry to help feed the kids at home, and also triple data allowances as well for our Verizon Innovative Learning Schools throughout, and $10 million to nonprofits directed to support students. So we've done so much to address the issue to make sure that all of our communities didn't fall behind through the pandemic, partnerships, and also providing substantial funding to make sure that everybody continues to stay online. Thank you.
Yeah, an amazing amount of activity, and particularly just nice to see that partnership you mentioned with LA. So that's amazing to hear about. Turning to Naomi, you've talked about how Salesforce took a flexible approach in responding to the needs of communities during the pandemic. Would you mind elaborating upon that a little bit more?
Yeah, so at Salesforce, we always think about how we can bring the full power of our company to support our communities. So beyond just our philanthropic dollars, how do we bring our product, our employees, different ways to support the community? And so I think with everyone on this call, we can say that it was an all hands on deck type of effort. We really had to sort of reinvent and rethink how we were going to support the community. And so, did things like sourcing and delivering 50 million pieces of PPE to hospitals and to groups that were in need, new product solutions like Work.com and Vaccine Cloud to think about how can we help companies reopen safely and also make sure we have equitable vaccine distribution. But then on the philanthropic side, I think in a lot of we just threw out the playbook that we had. We had to completely rethink our donation strategy. So we did a couple of really important shifts that were important. So we allowed our current grantees to reallocate restricted grant funding to cover their current needs. So whether that's a shift to digital online learning overnight, doing their own programmings, but we then also launched a COVID Rapid Response Fund to unlock those unrestricted dollars to make sure the organizations had that cash in hand. So we were seeing this huge surge in demand from all of our grantees and all of our partners, but they were also seeing that pivot to virtual programming. And I don't think it's quite recognized how much revenue was lost in nonprofits in those canceled fundraising events, which tend to be those high dollar fundraising moments. So we wanted to make sure that we had flexible funds that could go fast out into the community. We also, for the first time, looked at supporting small businesses. So we did $7 million in grants, which was a new area of focus for us because we knew that those were the groups that were really suffering also during the pandemic. And then we also completely rethought our employee volunteering policies. We let employees take time off and log hours for things like grocery shopping for their elderly neighbor or teaching a remote class for their kids, really just trying to say, hey, be there, be in your community, support where you need it. And I think just reflecting on this last year, so for those of us who've been in the disaster response space, usually disasters are localized, it's one market, it's one region, and your response can be really targeted. And this was the first time, at least in my career, that every segment, every region around the world needed help simultaneously. So we had to be super flexible, and we just had to, do what we could in the moment that we could and try and reach as many people as possible.
Amazing to hear about that, and pulling on one of those threads, small businesses. It's an area of our marketplace that I also have an opportunity to focus on at my current role. But for Cami, at LinkedIn, you have a direct opportunity to expand on this impact for both not only small businesses but also job seekers who have equally been hit hard during this pandemic. I would love to hear how LinkedIn, from your point of view, has looked to utilize its product offerings to support these groups, and how your social impact initiatives have shifted during this moment of COVID.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so much of what Naomi said resonates with me in terms of how we approached crisis response and how we think about trying to bring all of our assets to the table when we are tackling challenges, especially of this magnitude. And in response to the pandemic, we actually launched 2 COVID talent marketplaces. So one initially that we launched during the spring offered hundreds of thousands of free job posts and other hiring solutions for organizations that were doing surge hiring and volunteer recruitment in response to COVID-19. So we were able to direct over 500,000 members to volunteer opportunities, served organizations like Doctors on Demand that needed all of a sudden, 500 virtual healthcare workers as remote medicine was spiking. We were supporting supermarkets that needed thousands of store associates, the NHS in the UK that needed to find 30,000 doctors and 60,000 nurses. And we were really able to bring our recruiting engine to help support organizations during this critical time. We also had a pro bono recruiting team through our Recruiting for Good program who was offering pro bono hands-on support and screening for thousands of candidates for these opportunities. In addition, LinkedIn partnered with Microsoft, our parent company, and also GitHub to launch a global skills initiative back in June, which had the goal of bringing digital skills to more than 25 million people. And this was critical because as we saw, the transition to the digital economy happened super fast when COVID hit, probably years faster than it would have otherwise. And together we were able to use our data to identify in-demand jobs and the skills needed to fill them. We were able to create free access to different LinkedIn learning paths and content to help people develop these skills for in-demand positions. And then we offered low-cost certifications and free job-seeking tools to help people develop these skills and pursue new jobs. I won't talk as much about our philanthropic response right now, but I will say that we also made over $1 million in unrestricted emergency COVID relief grants to our nonprofit partners around the world quickly so that they could pivot and focus on their biggest needs. And then, not surprisingly, shifted all of our programming to virtual as soon as it happened, which created challenges, but also has provided a lot of opportunity in terms of the types of job seekers and organizations we've been able to reach.
Thank you, Cami. I agree that the rapid nature of the response is a critical element. And turning to Joan, along those lines, Lyft had announced this Lyft Up initiative shortly before the pandemic began. Tell us more about how Lyft looked to kind of utilize this newly formed initiative to address some of these needs. that were most highlighted or prioritized during this moment of COVID?
Yeah, definitely. So the thing that I love about Lift Up is that it actually wasn't necessarily new. It was more so finally pulling everything together that we've been doing comprehensively into one, formal program. So social impact has been baked into Lyft's DNA since we started, and so there's always been offshoots of social impact. And though as I joined the team and we started building out the team, what we really wanted to focus on is what is our unique superpower? What do we have to offer? And that's, for us, that's transportation. And so I loved hearing Erica and Cami and Naomi also talk about their own unique value adds with broadband for Verizon and hiring practices for LinkedIn. And so for us, transportation is one of those ways where it made us even more unique during the pandemic, where instead of going to virtual, we really actually leaned into where are those in-person needs still necessary, especially for folks who are essential workers or who still had to get to critical places, even in the midst of a pandemic. How do we offer that and support that? And so Lift Up is really our wrapper for how we think about all of our social impact work and offering transportation in these critical moments or these specific use cases. So the specific initiatives within Lift Up are really tied around those use cases. So things like grocery access, getting people to and from grocery stores, jobs access, getting people to and from job interviews or the first few weeks of work. And for the pandemic, we really actually just ended up leaning in. So those same things that are necessary in your day-to-day lives become almost even more critical when you're worrying about if you can get to your grocery store and get food safely, or figure out if maybe I don't feel comfortable getting to the grocery store, how do I get food to me at home? So for example, our grocery access program pivoted from just getting people to food, but also started doing delivery, so food to people. And we ended up doing, I think, over 2 million meals last year getting delivered. For jobs access, we also found a way to make that program a lot more accessible and open up the aperture for that, so more people could take advantage of that program. And I think that the one program that really we really leaned into is what a lot of people don't recognize is that Lyft is not just rideshare. We actually have a bikes and scooters network as well, and I think we're the largest bike share operator in the US. So when the pandemic hit, biking also became one of the most socially distanced ways to travel. And so we ended up opening up a critical workforce pass program that built on our models of equity passes for bikes and scooters. And we gave those to our essential workers, nurses, doctors, and saw our rider share increase significantly as we wanted to make sure that those essential personnel were able to travel safely during the pandemic.
Super interesting. And Joan, I'm going to stick with you because you're pulling on a really important topic around equity that I'd love to pivot this conversation towards now, speaking around the topics of social unrest and racial injustice that, of course, have been a meaningful part of our daily discourse lately. Joan, within the last year, there's been, obviously a rise in media attention surrounding racial injustice and social unrest. Speaking about how Lyft has approached this, how has Lyft used its platform and product offering? You've spoken to us a little bit here, but maybe expand a little bit further. How Lyft has supported and further advanced equity, diversity, and inclusion, and broadened that out to as broad of a swath of our society as possible.
Definitely. And I think actually this week, we just released an update on a lot of the commitments we've made over the years, and especially some of the ones that came out in 2020 with the heightened unrest and kind of racial justice needs. But racial equity, the way that we look at this is that it's really a foundational part of our work. And that's why you've heard us very specifically focus on use cases, not communities, not because communities are not important, but rather some of these use cases span multiple communities. So when we focus on something like grocery access, that then allows us to take a racial equity lens and prioritize multiple communities and different communities of color within that. And that becomes the driving foundation or the driving strategy around how we apply that lens across all of our programs. So we're ensuring that we're eliminating transportation as a barrier for under-resourced communities of color. One of the biggest things we did last year was we set up a program called the Access Alliance, which really, again, was bringing together the coalition of partners we've worked with for years. So groups like the NAACP, the National Urban League, the Black Women's Roundtable, and they really started advising us more directly on, okay, so you've got your basic use cases around grocery access, jobs access. What's next? Like, what else are those specific barriers that maybe are more relevant or more prescient for Black and Brown communities? And how do we start concocting those strategies and building things that are more tailored? And so that's really where the work is really continuing and where we're continuing to dig in. That's the stuff that's challenging here is this isn't one of those things where you launch a campaign for a couple of months and the work is done. Like this is work we're investing in for the next, I mean, not even next, but just for the future, right? For the years to come. And just kind of as a side kind of addendum to that, like what we had ended up doing as well was starting to experiment with other ways that we can bring our product and bring our programs to support these types of initiatives, especially when there were things like protests and civil unrest. How do we set up solidarity rides? How do we create opportunities for our writers to engage and donate through our platform? So there was a couple initiatives that we piloted last year through that. And everything I'm speaking to is really just the external program facing work, but we have like impact and racial equity cut across so many verticals at Lyft. So there are a ton of other teams at Lyft that make sure that our racial equity goals are also being hit across our I&D teams, across our ERGs, across our hiring, our supplier and diversity network. So there's a lot more happening, but I'm just sharing some of the work that I get to work on, and I'm grateful to collaborate with all of those colleagues as well.
Yeah, access is such an important fundamental component of solving for a lot of the issues that you've raised. Turning to Cami, I'm very curious to hear more about how LinkedIn, particularly within your organization, has tried to accomplish the same things for its employees, particularly around the equity, diversity, inclusion space. Please share a little bit more about that.
Will do. So we have had a big focus internally on making sure that we are living our values and creating a safe space for all of our employees. Our diversity, inclusion, and belonging team in particular has been at the center of this work and just done an absolutely incredible job, supporting the ERGs and all of our employees. A few specific things I would note is one, we've had a big focus on allyship. So LinkedIn actually created an allyship academy and lots of resources to help employees sort of learn more and be anti-racist and active allies in their day-to-day lives, both at work and at home. And there's also been a huge focus on mental well-being internally. And Joan, you'll laugh, but we have a program called Lift Up also, but it focused on lifting up each other and making sure we're sort of in it together and managing through this. And that has included a bunch of resources for employees along with wellness days. And we actually all got a week off in early April as part of this initiative to sort of reset, after a year of such challenges. I will say quickly, externally, we have been very focused on, supporting racial justice organizations, making philanthropic donations in response to Black Lives Matter and the racial justice reckoning. And we are also doing a lot of work on our product team and on our platform to make sure that we are creating equitable outcomes for every member of the global workforce, and that we are doing what we can to mitigate bias on LinkedIn.
Thank you for sharing that. Erica, similarly, at Verizon, what steps has your company taken to disperse these resources related to COVID and social unrest and racial injustice externally to increase support for these issues? And then even if you'd like to speak internally, we'd love to hear that as well.
Thank you for the question. I also echo my colleagues' sentiments as well. It's so important to address the issues on a multifaceted approach. And so a couple of things about Verizon. Racial injustice profoundly affects Verizon's three pillars of partnerships, which is digital inclusion, human prosperity, and climate protection. So Verizon's digital inclusion partners are working to ensure access for students and communities of color who are most likely to be disadvantaged by the digital divide. And we have partnerships with LA Promise Fund and Brotherhood Crusade, amongst others. Verizon Climate Protection Pillar also focuses on environmental justice, which is also very important for communities of color and underserved communities and underrepresented communities, which in Los Angeles can mean cleaner beaches and better air quality. And then also following the murder of George Floyd and subsequent global protests, Verizon has committed $10 million to organizations working towards racial justice. And I really encourage the students and folks on today's panel to get a chance to look at our CEO, Hans Vesterberg's statements. it was very profound once everything had happened. He was very, very committed to being a part of the solution and committed that Verizon is fiercely committed to diversity inclusion across all spectrums because it makes us in the world better. So it's definitely walking the talk, and it's great to be a part of an organization, and a CEO definitely believes in that, in steering the ship in that direction. And Verizon also stands with the African American community and API community as well. And we've made several donations to the Asian community, including the Asian American Advancing Justice in Los Angeles and API Mobilize. Also, I wanted to echo the importance of ERGs. Have so many great partners with our RV teamers, whether they represent the women's ERG, LGBT, Latino, African American API, Native American veterans, et cetera. It's been an amazing partnership where we can all come together and share space to kind of talk about what was going on, not only addressing the issues of the community that were the most pressing, but also taking the time for our V teamers to make sure that we were okay and that we were, all dealing with a lot of issues and to help unpack and process. So that was something that was very, very inspiring to me, because ultimately we came together to find solutions, but ultimately coming to make sure that we were okay to move forward, because it was such an unprecedented time. And also it was a great time to come together, to do our check-ins. We did a lot of social justice walks together virtually, and we did a lot of programs with the ERGs to make sure that we supported all of our vulnerable populations. So Verizon's also very committed to volunteer hours and encourages it. So it's been really great. It's been a very holistic approach, making sure the employees are taken care of, and most importantly, making sure our community is taken care of as well, especially during this unprecedented time. Thank you.
Yeah, it's clear that Verizon, given its breadth of coverage geographically, is also leveraging that footprint to have a breadth of impact along the dimensions you mentioned. Turning to Naomi, I'm aware that Salesforce recently launched a task force around racial equity and justice, particularly to address and advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion. Could you tell us a little bit more about that initiative? I'm curious to understand it better.
Yeah, so I think what you're hearing from my fellow panelists is this moment where words of sympathy and expressions of solidarity simply are not enough in this time that we're in, and that bold action and accountability is really what's needed. So Salesforce launched a company-wide racial equality and justice task force, which is focused on addressing racial inequality across 4 key pillars. We call it our 4 Ps: people, philanthropy, purchasing, and policy. The people is all about within our own walls, the hiring, promotion, inclusion strategies. Philanthropy is about our investments in the community, so how we're going to be reaching out and partnering with our community. Our purchasing is around how we source and fund the companies and entrepreneurs that we invest in. And then finally, policy, which is really the positions that we're going to take and advocate for around areas like police reform and civic engagement and voting rights. So it's bringing together all of the parts of Salesforce to drive this at the most senior levels of our company. So speaking specifically about philanthropy, and I do encourage anyone, you can go and look at salesforce.com/racial-equality, and you can see the commitments that we made, and we do regularly update on our actions to hold ourselves accountable. But in philanthropy in particular, we made a $200 million over 5-year commitment. This was a new area of focus for us. And so we spent a lot of time listening to the community, listening to our employees, learning, trying to understand where we were uniquely positioned and where we could support. And we ultimately landed on a few key focus areas. One is on economic development. And this really importantly is on closing that racial funding gap, not just for nonprofit leaders of color, but also entrepreneurs of color. The second area is around civic engagement. So creating a more inclusive democracy that represents the voices of every American. And finally, the last one is on system change and resilience. So really investing in the research and the data behind the challenges we face, and ensuring that as we're in this K-shaped recovery, that recovery is inclusive. And as a grant maker, we needed to also do some deep introspection and looking at our own funding. So we had to look at our own grant making data to understand not just how we invest our dollars, but where we're investing them, to make sure that we inadvertently weren't being part of the problem in that. And so making sure that we are focusing on providing general operating support, unrestricted grants, prioritizing organizations from Black and Latinx and other minority-led nonprofits, and thinking about supporting the small emerging leaders. And we recently launched a $2 million Catalyst Fund to do exactly that, to try and support and seed innovation from those leaders of color and those nonprofits.
Amazing. That website again, salesforce.com, what was it?
/racial-equality.
Racial-equality. All right, folks, check it out. And that was a perfect segue actually to the next topic I had in mind, which was about accountability. How do you make sure that we are tracking performance and actually having that impact that we aspire to? So Naomi, I'd love to stick with you on this topic. What metrics have you used or Salesforce used to kind of constitute a successful program?
So I think this is a really complicated and fraught question, actually, because I think there's two things there's tensions that we're working through. One is this idea of trust-based philanthropy. I think a lot of folks know about the nonprofit starvation cycle, that the challenge of getting unrestricted funds, it's considered the holy grail of funding. So any of you who sit on nonprofit boards or organizations, you know how important that unrestricted funding is, but only 20% of total giving goes to that. And then when you start to unpack that and you look at unrestricted funding, when you look at leaders of color, they get 6% less than their white counterparts, right? So this idea of creating this unrestricted funding, the trust-based philanthropy that says, you community leaders, we believe that you understand the challenges the best and that you have the best solutions. And so leaning into that. But the balance of that is we also have to have accountability. So you have to be able to understand the measures to know that we're moving the needle, right? So I think we've all heard that theme that, what gets measured matters. So how do we know that we're measuring the right thing? And I think there's a couple things that we need to think about in this. One is having a common set of measures. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are a super important part of that. This idea of all of us collectively working together instead of having every funder have their own measures that they're sort of, every nonprofit has to chase and report against, but thinking about those common measures, but also making sure that those measures are inclusive and asking ourselves, are we creating top-down solutions, or are we putting those with lived experiences at the center? Are they at the table when we are designing and deciding on those measures? So I think we have to create those measures. We need to have the common set, but it has to be inclusive. And then I also want to sort of focus on this idea of around, as we do that accountability, thinking about the burden on our grantees, that the way as funders that we've created systems where our grantees spend a lot of hours and a lot of time chasing down individual reports for individual funders, but thinking about that power dynamic and how we can support them in accelerating through this movement of trust-based philanthropy. So there's a lot there, but I think it's the area that philanthropy in general has to take that deep look at our own work and think about where we need to push this forward.
Thank you, Joan. Same topic. How do you set goals at Lyft for your social impact initiatives that really give accountability for providing that impact that you're hoping to achieve?
Yeah, I think that for us, the biggest thing that we think about are outputs and outcomes. For our programs like the grocery access, jobs access, voting access programs I've talked about earlier, we always want to know exactly how are they performing, but then also are they actually having the intended impact? And so the outputs are those very easy low-hanging fruits, like how many rides did we give, how many meals did we deliver, how many people did we serve, and those are things that, those numbers are great. And like I said earlier, we've delivered, I think, over 2 million meals. We've given hundreds of thousands of rides to the polls. But really, is that actually moving the needle on the impact transportation is having? That's where we have to get into outcomes. And the challenge is that outcomes just take a lot longer to study. So for example, one of the biggest challenges we've had is our team has existed for 3 years. So it sometimes takes 3 years just to get a study started and to do that research. And so we're doing that work now. But these are the longer term results we see as an effect, or as hopefully the intended effect of making the strategic investments that we have. So for something like jobs access, does that actually move the needle on the number of jobs landed or retained? And early results are showing yes, but we are trying to make sure that research is done in a rigorous and statistically significant way. are we moving the needle on how many people are deemed as no longer food insecure? So can we see the impact that transportation has on social determinants of health? Are we helping improve voter turnout rates? And it's sometimes really hard. Like one of the biggest challenges with social impact work in general is that it's a little bit squishy. And so pushing to make that more scientific and understanding that impact that we're having and trying to stay super focused on the role that transportation plays and understanding how that crosses against other socioeconomic factors is really important to us. So you'll see us start to report out on outputs, and what I hope to see us do as we continue is to do more of the outcomes-based work and really see how we're making those connections, and also working with other partners and institutions to systematize that work and make it more available to more people.
Yeah, it's a fantastic point that these issues are systemic and do require a longitudinal approach to measuring. So thank you for sharing that. Cami, a challenge that I'm sure everybody on this panel deals with, and I think is a really just pervasive thought experiment that everybody going into roles that you guys, all of you folks currently occupy, is how do you prioritize? How do you choose which initiatives are the highest priority for your company to invest their resources in when there's so much work to be done? And what kind of system do you potentially implement to determine which should rise to the top, and how would you kind of work through those issues step by step?
Yeah, this for us is one of the biggest challenges because there are so many things we could do. And I think as a social impact professional, it is so important to get really disciplined and focused about what initiatives we do invest in and where we sort of take big bets and where we stay away. And for us at LinkedIn, we just really focus on prioritizing areas where we think we can provide the most unique value given the assets that we have. So for example, a couple of years ago, we did launched a new initiative around closing the network gap based on some data that we had found on our platform that showed, where you live, where you go to school, and where you work can provide up to a 12 times advantage in accessing opportunity. And we felt LinkedIn had a really unique role that we could play in helping people build the networks, the relationships, and the social capital that they needed to advance in their careers, and felt like LinkedIn was sort of uniquely positioned in this space apart from, other companies, and that we could leverage our unique assets. And along those lines, I think our big focus on skills-based hiring really goes in that same direction. LinkedIn knows what skills professionals have around the world. We have over 740 members, and we also have this incredible set of resources through our LinkedIn Learning library of courses. And so I think we have a really unique role that we can play in helping individuals in the economy connect people with the skills that they need for their next opportunity. So I think it's hard. Unfortunately, I have to say no way more than I like to, which is one of the things I often tell people who want to break into this space. I'm like, you're going to have to make tough decisions and prioritize, but I think it's really important that we continue to ask ourselves where we can have the most impact, where our assets are best leveraged, and sort of play in that lane as much as possible versus trying to do everything under the sun.
Yeah, that makes sense. Very, very sensible approach. Erica, I'm also curious. Verizon is doing so much, as you referred to earlier. How do you think about what success looks like in tackling these problems, which can often be complex and quite hard to measure?
Thank you for the question. As my colleagues have said, it's so subjective, right? This is something that is incredibly new, and this is just the beginning of the drop in the ripple, hopefully towards a better society. So for us, success is about listening to our communities that we serve and engaging with them in meaningful ways for their daily lives. Success is also looked to as building trusted transformational partnerships with community organizations and leaders who know that Verizon will be there to lend a hand in a meaningful way. That's one of the things that during this pandemic, meeting with elected officials and these community-based organizations, it's like, we're here to support you. Yes, it's great to support you on a philanthropic basis, but we're also here to continue to work with you to help rebuild. Whether it's serving on boards, whether it's helping you with your food distributions, whether it's giving out face masks, whatever it is, we're here to serve. So ultimately, through the cities, how can we help support you? So a lot of our cities took a hit with the tax increments and whatnot. So how can we support you and how can we build? We understand the needs of your constituents. So how can Verizon be a partner? So instilling that we're more than just a philanthropic arm. We are a member of the community and being seen as a trusted member of the community. And we're here for the long term. We're not here for just a short, let's try to address this and move on for the next flavor of the month. No, this is something that Verizon is incredibly dedicated to. So continuing to develop that partnership and becoming that trusted resource is something that, to me, which identifies success. So also pushing hard in those conversations, having those hard conversations, listening, and then taking meaningful action, and making sure that we're not there, to talk down or try to assume that we know better than anyone else in the community. By all means, no, absolutely not. How can we help support them in their vision ultimately as the experts? And so one thing is for certain that I've also noticed is during this pandemic has shown us that reliable internet service is no longer a luxury. I mean, it is a necessity for all two communities to thrive together. So again, Verizon is so committed to finding connectivity solutions so we can move forward together. But ultimately, how can we be a global, national, and local partner to our community? So to me, that's how we identify success.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. And I think that's another great segue to the last topic that I had in mind to speak about today. Before we turn to the audience questions, Cami, thinking about your particular role in the context of your company, and then in this broader posture that a company is taking within the challenges that our society has to deal with, being a leader in corporate social responsibility at a big tech firm, what have been the biggest challenges in your eyes in utilizing the company's resources and influence to bring about positive change to society? I'm sure many folks are thinking about how they might try to accomplish the same things. Would love your insights.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think of my role as both focused externally and internally. So externally, working a lot with nonprofit and other corporate partners and engaging, in the social impact space at large. But internally, I think what a lot of people don't know is that we spend a ton of time influencing teams inside of the business. And I think that our work is much more successful when, we're not sitting as teams that are sort of separate from the core business, but when we're really working with, in our case, product teams, marketing teams, to make sure that we are building social impact into everything we do as a business. And I think that's where we can get scale and where we can have the most impact. However, I think that can be one of the most challenging areas, given how quickly companies like LinkedIn evolve and change. So to me, figuring out where to focus and then when to shift, given changing business priorities, can be challenging from a social impact perspective, and having to make some tough choices. So for example, we piloted last year a new initiative to support underconnected youth on the platform and went through a long process to sort of build and test. And after that pilot, unfortunately, realized the team was not resourced as much as it needed to be to really succeed, and that actually there were more effective ways to support that audience of underconnected youth by integrating them into some bigger efforts at the company. So we had to sort of sunset our pilot, but in order to have much bigger impact and pull into something else. So I think, being able to be flexible and pivot, and also to influence the teams who are building some of these products and features internally, is the biggest opportunity, but also the biggest challenge. And then I would say, another challenge, but a good one to have, is that our employees are so passionate about this work that, figuring out how to support and encourage that passion, but also channel it, is something that I know our team is often focused on. And we don't want to quell any of the enthusiasm at all, but we do want to make sure that, we're sort of marching towards one North Star goal when it comes to our social impact, and that we are trying to ladder up as much as possible to our company priorities.
I appreciate you sharing that. Going back to Erica, similar context, you've mentioned a lot of the things that Verizon is currently focused on. I'm curious moving forward, how can corporations more broadly, use the learnings from this past year to maybe support quality education, small business development, equitable access to capital, services and information, and other global goals in a more effective way. A lot there, but feel free to pick and choose between it.
Thank you. I agree with my colleague who mentioned, yes, it's the quantifiable, right? As far as what have we learned during this pandemic, what works and what doesn't, what's the best issue to address the immediate concerns, and also long-term strategic planning. So I'm also an adjunct professor as well. So to me, it's always about, being on the ground, understanding how we can deliver services, but also understanding, getting that feedback to make sure that we can chart a better goal, and also be flexible and nimble to shift when needed. Because ultimately what is needed in one particular region in Southeast Los Angeles is completely, different needs, in Northern Cal. So does a company continue to be authentically understanding what the needs are of the community so that we can go ahead and shift and augment, whether it's to support our small businesses, or how can we continue to make sure our folks are online nationally, and we make sure that we make a concerted effort on, bridging the digital divide. So there's just so much going on right now. So to me, it's ultimately one, addressing the immediate needs, having that ear on the ground, having those local community partnerships. And then two, how can we make a concerted, sustainable effort to make sure that we're able to create positive change as well.
Thank you, Joan. Similar topic, looking ahead, what role do you believe businesses should be playing in creating positive change for society?
I think one of the collective things you've heard from me and my panelists is that social impact isn't really a nice to have anymore. It's really a mandatory, and becoming a good corporate citizen, becoming a good community player is just a necessary part of doing business these days. And I think that that's really where the opportunities lie. Like for each company, again, as you've heard from me and my co-panelists, we all deal with social impact or approach it differently based off of the company that we're at, and what we have to offer. So understanding how you can be pushing for how businesses can push forward that social impact is something that's thought about in multiple arenas, that it is multifaceted. It's part of the business decisions rather than just in a philanthropic, charitable silo, I think really does signal that difference for how that impact then is pervasive and sustainable. And I think that one of the ways that can happen, so it is through things like ESG reporting. So the environmental social governance reporting is something that public companies have the option to do a report and share that with investors. And it's really a way to kind of put out everything that you're doing to support the community, whether it's sustainability, whether it's social, whether it's the way that you govern your business. And having that level of accountability actually really helps. And similar to what I heard Naomi mention earlier, like having people work towards similar goals like the SDGs, things like that, where we're actually elevating things beyond one specific team or one specific segment of the industry, I think really helps push all of us forward. And so that's where I really hope to see businesses moving in the future.
Thank you. Rounding out with Naomi, Salesforce has always been in so many ways on the bleeding edge of the industry. I'm curious, because of that, you have an interesting posture potentially thinking about what's coming next. And I'm curious what your predictions might be in a post-COVID world, and how you might see the role of corporate social responsibility evolving over that time.
Well, I think you've heard it in my fellow panelists here, this idea around we can't be siloed, right? I think if we were to be very successful in our job, we would completely work ourselves out of our job. If there's no longer a head of CSR or head of philanthropy or a head of community impact, then we're doing our job, right? This needs to be infused into the core business. This needs to be involved in the product, the decisions on how we build and design products, like Cami was talking about how we source, how we hire. This needs to be not about diverse hiring as a nice to have, but really about that talent strategy. All of these pieces need to be deeply embedded into the company. But I think we also have to recognize the challenge ahead of us. I reflect in this last year about when we started our investments in the public school system, we started by giving them iPads and Wi-Fi to make sure that they could do online digital learning. We're about 10 years into it, $100 million in, and the pandemic hits. And guess what? We're back to giving Wi-Fi and iPads to enable remote learning, which tells me that the system has not been changed yet. And so if we are going to be very successful, if we are going to support our communities in the way that we truly need to, we have to be going upstream from this perpetual Band-Aid approach to supporting our communities. We have to be thinking about the intersections, the systems, the policies, the programs behind it that create this perpetual inequity. And so that will come when, as a company, we think about it being everyone's job to invest in this sustainable future.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. And I appreciate that and all the panel's thoughts on all these topics. We're going to actually now turn to audience questions. I'm seeing a lot of great activity here in the Slido. Thank you, everyone, for jumping in and upvoting, et cetera. We're just going to dive right in. And the first question comes from a prospective MBA, Lauren, who's curious to ask, I guess, the group, who were the most impactful learning partners? Examples are community foundations, thought leaders, business circles, when you might have needed to quickly calibrate and pivot. Anyone could take this question. Feel free to just chime right in.
I can hop in. This question made me smile because this was pretty much my entire life for 6 months of last year, was just calling our partners and saying, what is happening in the world? What do you need? And so I would say, like, one of our biggest partners, United Way, they have been with us from the very start of our social impact programming. We were on the phone, texting, calling multiple times a day I still do that now, but like for definitely a very good portion of time, just understanding, hey, we've built this awesome program, Ride United. It's all about getting rides to people in need. But how do we then pivot? Because they were at the front and center. They were one of the biggest community orgs and partners in local areas. How are they seeing changes happen? What are they seeing on the front lines, and what do they need? And just that common theme, I think for sometimes when you're a student, it's kind of a black box. You don't know exactly what happens, but it's really as simple as getting back on the phone with your partners and just letting them drive the conversation and tell you where the needs are, what can be helpful. And of course, then having to cross-check and understand what's possible on our end from the company's perspective and from our product's perspective. But that was really with what a lot of our major partners, so like United Way, Goodwill, the YMCA, and a ton of hyper-local community partners. We have about 700 plus partners in the Lift Up world. We really just dug in to understand, how can you define what solutions you want, and where can we support?
Thank you.
Echo that
Please.
As well. It was such a, pandemic hit, the world changed, and everybody had to pivot all at the same time. And from just the basic issues of everyone calling, they needed hotspots, they needed internet connectivity. But this was now not longer an LA, Southern Cal focus. This was now nationally. So addressing all of those particular immediate needs. But to me, what really spoke to me was when Ultimate reached out and said, look, we need technology because our seniors can't come to the PACE centers anymore. So we need equipment to go, just basic quality of life medical issues is something we absolutely jumped in and provided that, as well as, okay, what do you need? We need to set up these pop-up clinics for our community, predominantly underserved, uninsured communities, and make sure everybody is tested. And so, absolutely jumped in there. Partnered with East LA Community Foundation, and we thought, okay, well, what do you need? Hotspots, or what technology do you need? And it was ultimately, we need just basic. Our poor students are now addressing issues of home insecurity, being unhoused, as well as other extra negative externalities that occurred during the pandemic. So it was jumping into those immediate issues and addressing the most pressing needs, and then shifting also long term. Okay, let's help folks get back online, as far as trying to give them whatever resources that they need, and then in addition to moving on with internet and technology as ever we could support it. But ultimately, it was definitely, we couldn't do it alone. We had to have those trusted community partners that came to us, and we were able to work together towards solutions. So it's definitely a collective, collaborative process.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna move to the next question from Frank, who brings in a fantastic acquisition that I'm personally fond of. When Ben & Jerry's was acquired by Unilever, people worried that it would mean what it would mean to the ice cream company, but it was a huge positive. Cami, now that LinkedIn is acquired by Microsoft, how has that empowered LinkedIn to do more better? Example, GitHub. A bit of a broader question, but maybe we can take it in a social impact direction.
Yeah. Well, this is a great question, and it has personally been just such an interesting learning experience for me to live through. this acquisition and sort of see how it has unfolded over the past few years. I will say this, LinkedIn has remained very independent in terms of how we operate, but increasingly we are starting to partner more with the Microsoft team, and in our world with the Microsoft Philanthropies and social impact teams, to figure out areas where we can come together and collaborate. And it really does feel like the opportunities are endless. I think there is so much value that LinkedIn is getting and can get for our social impact programs by plugging into all of the assets and reach and offerings that Microsoft brings to the table. The Microsoft Skills Initiative that I mentioned earlier, I think is a great example where we were able to come together with Microsoft, LinkedIn, and GitHub quickly after the pandemic started to reach 25 million learners. And we actually hit that goal and exceeded it by 5 million. So it's been amazing to see how our assets can come together. And we're just still working through what more we can do to capitalize on that opportunity.
Thank you for sharing that. Question from a prospective MBA. Mark Benioff, Salesforce's CEO, is a huge advocate of stakeholderism. Naomi, how do you view Salesforce's philanthropy, impact investing, for example, the $100 million fund at Salesforce, its one-to-one-to-one model, as well as unique projects like Salesforce Park?
I love this question. Thank you, whoever submitted this one. I get to talk to things I love talking about. So stakeholder capitalism. So for those who aren't familiar with this term, the idea of stakeholder capitalism is around serving all stakeholders. So your customers, your employees, your partners, the planet, society, and also your shareholder. So thinking about the business of business as improving the state of world. And so this idea is infused so deeply in the way that Salesforce approaches its work. This is grounded in what's called our 1-1-1 model. So for those who aren't familiar, at our founding, we committed 1% of our product, 1% of our equity, and 1% of our employee time to supporting our communities around the world. This has grown and evolved with this over time. It has also inspired the Pledge 1% movement, which is a really phenomenal organization. If you're not familiar with, check them out. There's 12,000 companies around the world who have made a similar type of pledge, who have said they are going to bring the community in as a core stakeholder in their business. And they, through that, have unlocked billions of social capital over the years to support the community. So this is really about thinking about that full business. I've mentioned a couple of times on this call about that full power of our company. And so things like our impact investing, being able to think about our Salesforce Ventures arm as the organizations that they're going to be support who are going to be advancing the success of our education system, of our planet, the future of equality, and investing in that there. And so it's a way of thinking about the full business as comprehensive and inclusive of the community.
Thank you. Question from Sarah. Joan, you are inspiring. In Business Insider, you mentioned giving cash might be the best option in helping others. Could you elaborate the decision-making process and how do you measure the impact from cash donations?
That is very sweet and made my day. And I actually think Naomi did a great job touching on this earlier, when she talked about how unrestricted cash grants can be like the holy grail for a lot of nonprofits, especially in terms of support. So in the context of that Business Insider interview, they were asking, this was right at the beginning of the pandemic, and the reporter was asking, like, what can people personally do? Everyone feels such a desire to do something. They're stuck at home. What can they do? They can't go out and volunteer. They can't leave their houses right now. And that's where I said, like, one of the things that I've heard the most from our partners as well is just similar to what Naomi was saying, like the fundraising events aren't happening, the galas look a lot different, and the cash flows were changing dramatically. So that's where I think that if you are on a personal level, if you're trying to support organizations and you want to know what's the best way, you maybe time and talent aren't the right fit for you at this point in time, like unrestricted cash grants to nonprofits makes a very big difference. And even if it's small, it's not an institutional grant from a big company or something like that, it still matters. And then for me, one of the ways that I've always personally try to vet who I give my personal funds to is I just get involved. And again, I know volunteering looks different these days, but especially if you're MBA students, there's a lot of pro bono work that I think nonprofits would be very happy to take advantage of. And that allows you to build relationships with folks in the social impact space, with leadership teams at nonprofits, and that those relationships will also help you understand how is this nonprofit thinking about their donations and their investments and their work, and do I feel comfortable and do I feel like this is a good investment of my own personal resources. So those are just my personal thoughts, not necessarily relevant to the work I do at Lyft, but if it's helpful at all to guide your own personal philanthropy, that's what I would share as my 2 cents.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to go to Stephen, which is asking kind of a question to the group, but I'll ask, given time, only one of the panelists to answer this. So the question is, each of your firms have identified and addressed needs in communities for COVID. How have your firms thought about the processes of structuring solutions to optimize uptake of or engagement with solutions in these communities?
I can take this one. I'm going to point to a project that we just launched through the Salesforce.org Impact Lab. This was co-developing with our community, with the community leaders, a technology product that will help address homelessness. So it was going through a design sprint with those organizations, with folks from the Bay Area, like Hamilton Families, from the city of San Francisco, along with our technologists, to come together to go through that process and co-design that solution that then we put out on our app exchange for nonprofits who are working in case management who could adopt that. What was really important about this was trying to bring together all of the expertise around this one issue. So we are not experts in homelessness, but we are technology experts. So that's what we can bring to the table. We can bring together the folks who are working in the public policy and the people who are doing the direct delivery and service. And so coming up with a solution that co-designs it, that's where you're going to have better uptake. When you do it in a vacuum, when you do it in an idea that's done over on this side, you're not going to be able to understand the unique needs and how a community would use those products or those services. So it's really important to have that inclusive design process from the beginning to help ensure the uptake in the long term.
Thank you. Folks, stick around. We have a quick closing comment from Sophia with some important information, but I want to just thank everyone for joining the panel, for being here, clearly experts in your space, and we are fortunate to have had some of your time to learn a lot in a little bit amount of time here at UCLA Anderson. So thank you again. Sophia, thanks again for you and your team's efforts here. I'll pass it to you to close us out.
Thank you again for attending today's discussion, and a big thank you to our amazing panelists, Erica, Cami, Joan, Naomi, and our moderator, Subin.